first hours of the new year in 2009, just weeks before Barack Obama was to be inaugurated as the next president, shots rang out in Oakland, California. A transit officer named Johannes Messerly shot an unarmed 22-year-old black man who lay face down in handcuffs on a public transportation platform. His name was Oscar Grant. Dozens of witnesses, many of whom were returning to Oakland after New Year's Eve celebrations, watched in horror. Some captured his killing on smartphones. Shortly afterward, Black Oakland exploded in palpable anger, with hundreds, then thousands of people taking to the streets demanding justice. Perhaps this outcry would have happened under any circumstance, but the brutality of Grant's death in the few weeks before the country's first black president was to take office felt like a shock of cold water. Police brutality had long been a fact of life in California, but the country was supposed to have entered into a post-racial parallel universe. The optimism that coursed through Black America in 2008 seemed a million miles away. A local movement led by Grant's family unfolded across the Bay Area to demand that prosecutors charge and try Messerly. Protests, marches, campus activism, public forums, and organizing meetings sustained enough pressure to force local officials to charge Messerly with murder. It was the first murder trial of a California police officer for a line-of-duty killing in 15 years. In the end, Messerly, convicted of involuntary manslaughter, spent less than a year in prison. But the local movement foreshadowed events to come. As for President Obama, he turned out to be very different from candidate Obama, who had stage-managed his campaign to resemble something closer to a social movement. His administration, however, with the full effects of the recession still pulsing in black communities, the conflict between the black president and his base could be detected. Black America was amid an economic freefall as black wealth disappeared. As black unemployment was climbing into the high double digits, civil rights leaders asked Obama if he would craft policies to address black joblessness. He responded, "I have a special responsibility to look out for the interests of every American. That's my job as President of the United States. And I wake up every morning trying to promote the kinds of policies that are going to make the biggest difference for the most number of people so that they can live out their American dream." It was a disappointing response, even if that disappointment did not manifest itself in his approval ratings. In 2011, with black unemployment above 13%, 86% of black Americans approved of the overall job the president was doing, but 56% expressed disappointment in the area of providing proper oversight for Wall Street and the big banks. For African Americans, Obama's presidency had been largely defined by
Did you know that
reluctance to engage with the ways that racial discrimination was blunting the impact of his administration's recovery efforts? Obama has not shown nearly the same reticence when publicly chastising African Americans for a range of behaviors that read like a handbook on anti-black stereotypes, from parenting skills and dietary choices to sexual mores and television watching habits. There is something disingenuous in focusing on poor and working-class black people, without any discussion about the ways that the criminal justice system has disappeared black parents from the lives of their children. When Obama talks about absentee black fathers, he never mentions the disparity in arrests and sentencing that is responsible for the disproportionate number of missing black men. Few media discussions about Obama's candidacy mentioned curbing the nation's criminal justice system's voracious appetite for black bodies. 1 million African Americans are incarcerated, and 1 in 4 black men between 20 and 29 are under the control of the criminal justice system. Over his first term, Obama paid no special attention to the mounting issues involving law enforcement and imprisonment, even as Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow described the horrors that mass incarceration and corruption throughout the legal system had inflicted on black families. None of this began with Obama, but it would be naive to think that African Americans were not considering the destructive impact of policing and incarceration when they turned out in droves to elect him. His unwillingness to address the effects of structural inequality eroded younger African Americans' confidence in the transformative capacity of his presidency. There was one moment when black America collectively came to terms with Barack Obama's refusal to use his position as president to intervene on behalf of African Americans. Troy Davis was a black man on death row in the state of Georgia. It was widely believed that he had been wrongfully convicted, which would mean that in the fall of 2011, he was facing execution for a crime he had not committed. Davis's cries of innocence were not a voice in the wilderness. For years, he and his sister, Martina Davis Correa, had joined with anti-death penalty activists to fight for his life and exoneration. By September 2011, an international campaign was underway to have him removed from death row. The protests grew larger and more frantic as the death date crept closer. There were protests around the world. Support from global dignitaries rolled in as the international movement to stop Davis's execution took shape. The European Union and the governments of France and Germany implored the United States to halt his execution, as did Amnesty International and the former FBI Director William Sessions. A Democrat in the Georgia Senate, Vincent Fort, called on those charged with carrying out the execution to refuse to do it. We call on the members of the injection team. Strike. Do not follow your orders. Do not start the flow of the lethal injection chemicals. If you refuse to participate, you make it that much harder for this immoral execution to be carried out. As Davis's execution drew near on the evening of the 20th of September, people from around the world waited for Obama to say or do something, but in the end he did nothing. He never even made a statement, instead sending Press Secretary Jay Carney to deliver a statement on his behalf, which simply noted that it was not appropriate for the president to intervene in a state-led prosecution. In the end, the black president succumbed to states' rights. It was a moment of awakening for Generation O and of newfound understanding of the limits of black presidential power, not because Obama could not intervene as his handlers insisted, but because he refused to do so. The Troy Davis protests were certainly not in vain. The day after the state of Georgia killed Davis, Amnesty International and the campaign to end the death penalty called for a day of outrage and protest. More than 1,000 people marched, eventually making their way to a small encampment on Wall Street that was calling itself Occupy Wall Street. The killing of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida in the winter of 2012 was a turning point. Like the murder of Emmett Till nearly 57 years earlier, Martin's death pierced the delusion that the U.S. was post-racial. Till was the young boy who, on his summer vacation in Mississippi in 1955, was lynched by white men for an imagined racial transgression. Till's murder showed the world the racist brutality pulsing in the heart of the world's greatest democracy. To emphasize the point, his mother, Mamie, opted for an open casket funeral to show the world how her son had been mutilated and killed in the land of the free. Martin's crime was walking home in a hoodie, talking on the phone, and minding his own business. George Zimmerman, now a well-known menace but then portrayed as an aspiring security guard, racially profiled Martin, telling the 911 operator, "This guy looks like he's up to no good or he's on drugs or something." The guy was a 17-year-old boy walking home from a convenience store. Zimmerman followed the boy, confronted him, and eventually shot him in the chest, killing him shortly thereafter. When the police came, they accepted Zimmerman's account. Martin was black, and the default assumption was that he was the aggressor, so they treated him as such. They tagged him as a John Doe, and made no effort to find out if he lived in the neighborhood or was missing. But the story began to trickle through the news media, and as more details became public, it was clear that Martin had been the victim of an unlawful killing. Trayvon Martin had been lynched. Within weeks, protests bubbled up across the country. The demand was simple: arrest George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The anger was fueled, in part at least, by the overwhelming double standard. If Martin had been white and Zimmerman black, Zimmerman would have faced immediate arrest, if not worse. For weeks, Obama deflected questions, commenting only that it was a local case. It took more than a month for Obama to finally speak publicly about the case, saying, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. When I think about this boy, I think about my own kids." But he also said, "I think every parent in America should be able to understand why it is absolutely imperative that we investigate every aspect of this, and that everybody pulls together, federal, state, and local, to figure out exactly how this tragedy happened." Obama could not come out and say the obvious, but the fact that he spoke at all was evidence of the growing momentum of the street protests that had been building for weeks. Martin's killing was a national and international embarrassment. Black people may have understood that Obama could not lead a social movement against police brutality as the president, but how could he not use his seat to amplify black pain and anger? It was exactly for moments like these that black people put Obama in the White House is impossible to know or predict, when a particular moment is transformed into a movement. 45 days after George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin in cold blood, he was finally arrested. It was the outcome of weeks of protests, many of which had been organized through social media, beyond the conservatizing control of establishment civil rights organizations. In the summer of 2013, more than a year after his arrest, George Zimmerman was found not guilty of the murder of Trayvon Martin. His exoneration crystallized the burden of black people. Even in death, Martin would be vilified as a thug and an aggressor, Zimmerman portrayed as his victim. The judge even instructed both parties that the phrase racial profiling could not be mentioned in the courtroom, let alone used to explain why Zimmerman had targeted Martin. Obama addressed the nation saying, "I know this case has elicited strong passions, and in the wake of the verdict, I know those passions may be running even higher. But we are a nation of laws, and a jury has spoken. We should ask ourselves as individuals and as a society how we can prevent future tragedies like this. As citizens, that's a job for all of us. What does it mean to be a nation of laws when the law is applied inequitably? There is a dual system of criminal justice, one for African Americans and one for whites. The result is the discriminatory disparities in punishment that run throughout all aspects of American jurisprudence. George Zimmerman benefited from this dual system. He was allowed to walk free for weeks before protests pressured officials into arresting him. He was not subjected to drug tests, though Trayvon Martin's dead body had been. This double standard undermined public proclamations that the U.S. is a nation built around the rule of law. Obama's call for quiet individual soul-searching was a way of saying that he had no answers. Out of despair over the verdict, the community organizer Alicia Garza posted a simple hashtag on Facebook, #BlackLivesMatter. It was a powerful rejoinder that spoke directly to the dehumanization and criminalization that made Martin seem suspicious in the first place and allowed the police to make no effort to find out to whom this boy belonged. It was a response to the oppression, inequality, and discrimination that devalue black life every day. It was everything in 3 simple words. In the few weeks after the Black Lives Matter trend went sporadic, a number of police officers were killed in Dallas and Baton Rouge, and the nation has turned its attention to mourning their lives. President Obama swiftly condemned the violence as vicious, calculated, and despicable. Of course, every loss of life is tragic, but hundreds of police officers are not being killed every year. It is not a common occurrence to kill a police officer and not be charged with a crime. The amount of violence experienced by police officers is not comparable to that which they inflict. So when the president writes an official letter to law enforcement that glosses over all of this in an attempt to offer his full-throated support for them, he continued the mythologizing of police heroism that protects them from prosecution and reform. When Obama says, "When you see civilians at risk, you don't see them as strangers," you wonder if he was referring to Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, or Ayanna Stanley Jones. When he tells these police officers, you see them as your own family, and you lay your life on the line for them. It's curious if that family includes the 13 women sexually assaulted by Daniel Holtzclaw in Oklahoma City, and the thousands more who are afraid to report. You put others' safety before your own. You remind us that loving our country means loving one another, Obama wrote as if he hadn't seen the video Diamond Reynolds captured in the aftermath of the shooting of Philando Castile, with Reynolds' 4-year-old daughter in the back seat. Did that officer consider their safety? Even when some protest you protect them. And images of Ferguson come to mind, where tanks, rubber bullets, and tear gas were deployed to subdue a population. Time and again you make the split-second decisions that could mean life or death for you and many others in harm's way. Obama's letter to law enforcement reads, but the real question remains, why is it that those split-second decisions so often leave black people dead or fearing for their lives? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like.